In this isolated hollow, one man held fast to his land. Carl Isaacs, trapper, farmer, and neighbor to none, faced eviction in the spring of 1932. 23 lawmen rode in to carry him out. None rode back. What happened?
Between November 3rd and November 5th, 1889, 23 law enforcement officers died during a three-day siege at remote Homestead in Montana Territory mountains, where Carl Isaacs had defended property from raid that U.S. Marshal James Crawford had organized based on false accusation from neighboring rancher claiming Isaacs was harboring fugitive. Raid conducted without warrant and without verification of informant's claims, despite Marshall knowing that accuser had long-standing property dispute with Isaacs over boundary line separating their adjoining lands. By November 6th, all 23 officers who'd participated in initial assault were dead, their bodies scattered across 40 acres surrounding log cabin, where Isaacs had lived alone for 12 years, after moving to Montana Territory, seeking isolation from society, whose legal systems he'd distrusted after witnessing father's wrongful conviction and execution in Missouri for murder. That brother had later confessed to committing. The Montana territorial government would classify it as deadliest law enforcement operation in Western history. Unprecedented case where a single individual had systematically eliminated officers during defensive campaign requiring tactical sophistication and intimate terrain knowledge that mountaineer who'd lived on property for over a decade possessed, while attackers who were outsiders to region had underestimated capabilities of man defending home from raid that had no legal justification, and that had been motivated by personal vendetta from informant whose boundary dispute with Isaacs had created incentive for using law enforcement as weapon against neighbor he'd failed to defeat through legitimate legal proceedings. But motive wasn't anti-government extremism or criminal enterprise protection. It was man defending home from illegal invasion by authorities who'd violated constitutional protections requiring warrants based on probable cause rather than accepting uncorroborated accusations from sources with obvious conflicts of interest, proving that even law enforcement officers face fatal consequences when conducting operations without proper legal authorization and when underestimating defensive capabilities of individuals who view their homes as worth dying and killing to protect. If you're ready to hear how Mountain Survivor became most lethal homesteader in Montana history, systematically slaughtering 23 lawmen who stormed his remote property without warrant, hit that subscribe button. But understand this story contains dramatized account of systematic violence against law enforcement during 1880s, when constitutional protections were frequently ignored in territorial regions and when defensive killings during illegal raids were sometimes viewed as justified homicide rather than murder, when authorities had violated legal requirements for conducting searches and arrests. Flathead County, Montana Territory, occupied 5,000 square miles of Rocky Mountain wilderness in 1889. Populated by fewer than 3,000 people, mostly living in small settlements near Flathead Lake, or working isolated mining claims or homesteads scattered throughout mountainous terrain where harsh winters and limited accessibility made survival difficult for anyone lacking wilderness skills and self-sufficiency that frontier conditions required. November 1889 meant temperatures dropping below freezing regularly. First heavy snows making travel treacherous on primitive trails connecting isolated properties to nearest towns where supplies and law enforcement were based. Season when homesteaders prepared for months-long winter isolation by stockpiling provisions and firewood that would sustain them until spring thaw made outside contact feasible again. Carl Isaacs was 41 years old in 1889, had lived on remote homestead in Flathead County mountains since 1877, when he'd arrived from Missouri seeking isolation after watching father executed for murder that Carl's brother Thomas had committed, but that father had been convicted of when circumstantial evidence and perjured testimony from witnesses, motivated by personal grudges, had resulted in wrongful conviction that appeals courts had upheld despite obvious reasonable doubts about guilt. Carl had witnessed execution, had understood that legal systems could kill innocent people, when prosecutors prioritized convictions over truth, and when courts deferred to jury verdicts regardless of evidence suggesting mistakes had occurred, had decided that living away from society, whose institutions had murdered his father, was preferable to participating in communities where such injustices were routine rather than exceptional. Isaac's homestead occupied 160 acres of mountain valley, accessible only through narrow trail that wound through forest and crossed stream that became impassable during spring floods. Isolation that Carl had specifically selected because remoteness provided protection from authorities and neighbors whose interactions Carl viewed as threats to autonomy that Montana wilderness enabled for those willing to accept hardships that solitary mountain living imposed. Carl had built log cabin, established garden, maintained small herd of cattle, developed hunting and trapping skills that supplemented agricultural production, created self-sufficient operation requiring minimal contact with outside world that he'd left behind when fleeing Missouri, and memories of father's wrongful execution. The boundary dispute with neighboring rancher Marcus Webb had begun in 1885 when Webb purchased property adjoining Carl's homestead, claimed that survey markers placed by previous owner had been incorrect, and that actual boundary line extended 60 acres into territory that Carl had been improving and using since 1877 arrival. Carl disputed Webb's claims, presented evidence including original survey documents and improvements he'd made over 8 years, demonstrating where boundaries had been established, hired surveyor who confirmed that Webb's proposed boundary revision was incorrect and that original markers accurately reflected legal property lines. Webb rejected surveyor's findings, filed lawsuit in territorial court seeking judicial determination of correct boundary location. Territorial court ruled in Carl's favor in 1886, accepted surveyor's testimony and original documents, proving that Webb's claims were unfounded, ordered Webb to pay Carl's legal expenses totaling $800 for costs defending against frivolous lawsuit. Webb refused payment, appealed ruling to Montana Territorial Supreme Court, which affirmed lower court's decision in 1887, increased damages to $1,200, including appeal costs, and imposed sanctions against Webb for pursuing meritless claim that court characterized as attempted theft through legal manipulation. Webb's refusal to accept judicial rulings and to pay ordered damages created ongoing conflict, Webb apparently deciding that if he couldn't acquire Carl's land through legitimate legal proceedings, he would attempt to use law enforcement as weapon for harassing neighbor he'd failed to defeat in court. Webb filed complaint with U.S. Marshal James Crawford in October 1889, claimed that Carl was harboring fugitive named Robert Mitchell, who was wanted for bank robbery in Wyoming, provided description matching Carl's general appearance, and asserted that he'd personally observed Mitchell at Carl's homestead on multiple occasions during recent months. Webb's complaint was fabrication, motivated by boundary dispute. No fugitive named Robert Mitchell existed. Description Webb provided was deliberately generic to match Carl himself. Observations Webb claimed were entirely invented as pretext for law enforcement raid, that Webb hoped would harass Carl or potentially discover something during search that could be used to prosecute neighbor who'd defeated him in court. Marshal Crawford accepted Webb's complaint without verification, failed to investigate whether fugitive Robert Mitchell actually existed, or whether warrants had been issued for anyone matching description Webb provided. Organized raid on Carl's homestead for November 3rd, involving 23 federal marshals and territorial deputies that Crawford recruited for operation, he characterized as apprehending dangerous fugitive who might be armed and who would likely resist arrest. Crawford's decision to conduct raid without obtaining warrant was constitutional violation. Fourth Amendment required that searches and arrests be based on warrants supported by probable cause. Accepting uncorroborated accusation from source with obvious conflict of interest didn't establish probable cause sufficient for judicial officer to issue warrant that Crawford should have obtained before organizing armed raid on isolated homestead. Crawford apparently believed that territorial conditions justified relaxing constitutional requirements, that apprehending fugitives in wilderness regions required flexibility about legal procedures, that urban jurisdictions could follow more strictly, that homesteader living alone on remote property wouldn't possess capability to resist 23 officers even if he objected to warrantless raid. The assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. Carl possessed both constitutional knowledge, understanding that warrantless raid was illegal, and tactical capabilities that mountain warfare experience and intimate terrain familiarity gave him when defending property he'd specifically chosen, for defensibility against threats he'd anticipated might materialize when living in region where legal protections were frequently ignored by authorities who believed frontier conditions exempted them from constitutional limitations. The raid began dawn November 3rd, when 23 officers approached Carl's homestead along trail, providing only access route to valley where cabin was located. Officers traveling on horseback in column formation that tactical training would have warned against when approaching potentially hostile location, but that Crawford's overconfidence about overwhelming numerical superiority had led him to believe was adequate, despite vulnerability that narrow trail created when retreat would be impossible if resistance was encountered. Carl observed approach from concealed position on ridgeline overlooking trail, recognized that large group of armed men moving toward his property represented either law enforcement raid or criminal attack, decided that either scenario justified defensive preparations, given that legitimate authorities would have announced themselves and would have presented warrant rather than conducting dawn assault, suggesting illegal operation. Carl's defensive advantages were extraordinary. 12 years living on property had given him intimate knowledge of terrain, including concealed positions providing observation and firing lines covering all approaches to cabin. He'd specifically selected Homestead for defensibility, anticipating that isolation might require defending against threats, whether from criminals or from authorities whose constitutional violations he'd witnessed throughout life. He possessed hunting rifles and ammunition stockpiled for subsistence living, but that proved equally effective for defensive combat. Most significantly, he understood that narrow trail providing only access meant that attackers would have no retreat route if their advance was stopped, and that they'd be trapped in kill zone where defensive fire from elevated positions would eliminate them systematically before they could withdraw to safety. Carl initiated defensive fire when officers were midpoint on trail approaching cabin. First shots killed lead marshal and horse, creating obstruction blocking trail. Subsequent fire targeted officers attempting to retreat or to find cover along narrow path, offering minimal protection from elevated shooter whose position couldn't be identified from below. The initial engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes, killed 6 officers and wounded 8 others. Forced survivors to retreat to wider area where trail entered valley, demonstrated to Crawford that Homesteader possessed both capability and determination to resist raid regardless of overwhelming numerical superiority that officers had believed would prevent resistance. Crawford attempted to negotiate with Carl after initial engagement, shouted that officers were federal marshals conducting legitimate law enforcement operation, demanded that Carl surrender, and claimed that resistance was futile when additional officers could be summoned if necessary. Carl responded that raid was illegal without warrant, that he'd committed no crime and harbored no fugitives, that officers needed to withdraw from his property immediately, or defensive fire would continue until all intruders were eliminated. Carl's response demonstrated both constitutional knowledge and tactical confidence, understood that warrantless raid was illegal invasion regardless of officers' claims about legitimate authority, believed that defensive capabilities he'd demonstrated meant he could withstand siege if authorities refused to withdraw. Crawford refused to retreat, apparently believing that accepting defeat after losing 6 officers would damage professional reputation and would establish precedent that armed homesteaders could resist federal operations, when actually constitutional requirements meant that warrantless raids shouldn't have been conducted regardless of whether resistance was encountered. Crawford ordered continued assault throughout November 3rd and 4th, officers attempting multiple approaches to cabin, but encountering defensive fire from elevated positions that Carl occupied rotationally to prevent attackers from determining his location. Systematic elimination that killed additional officers during each assault. While Carl suffered no casualties beyond minor wounds from return fire that officers managed despite being pinned in valley, where Carl's elevated positions gave him insurmountable advantages. By evening, November 4th, 17 officers were dead, and 6 were wounded, including Crawford himself, who'd been hit during afternoon assault attempting to flank Carl's positions. Remaining functional officers were exhausted from 2 days of combat without adequate food or shelter, in freezing temperatures that Montana November imposed on anyone caught in mountains without proper preparations. Crawford ordered final assault for dawn November 5th, apparently believing that overwhelming surviving officers in single coordinated attack would succeed where incremental attempts had failed, that Carl must be running low on ammunition after 2 days of sustained defensive fire, even though actually Carl had stockpiled hundreds of rounds for hunting and for exactly the kind of defense that raid had required. The final assault on November 5th was suicide mission, 6 exhausted officers advancing across open ground toward cabin, where Carl occupied fortified position with clear fields of fire. Desperate attack that tactical training would have prohibited, but that Crawford's determination not to retreat without accomplishing mission had led him to order despite obvious futility. Carl killed all 6 officers, including Crawford, during assault lasting less than 15 minutes, systematic fire that eliminated each officer as they attempted to advance. Final deaths that completed defensive campaign, killing all 23 officers who'd participated in warrantless raid that constitutional requirements had prohibited, and that tactical incompetence had transformed into massacre when commander had refused to withdraw after initial engagement, had demonstrated that Homestead possessed defensive capabilities that numerical superiority couldn't overcome. Carl buried 23 bodies in mass grave near property boundary, marked location with wooden cross-listing names, and noting that these men died conducting illegal raid without warrant in violation of Constitution they'd sworn to defend. Memorial that Carl viewed as appropriate acknowledgement that officers' deaths had been caused by their own constitutional violations rather than by criminal resistance to legitimate authority. He documented raid in detailed journal entry, explaining that defensive killings had been necessary to protect property from illegal invasion, that officers had been warned to withdraw, and had been given multiple opportunities to retreat before final assault, had forced him to eliminate remaining intruders, that he felt no guilt about killings that had been purely defensive response to attack that authorities had no legal right to conduct. Montana Territorial Governor learned about raid's failure in mid-November, when officers failed to return, and when relatives began inquiring about their whereabouts. Organized investigation that discovered mass grave and found Carl's memorial, documenting that warrantless raid had provoked defensive response, killing all participants. Investigation revealed that Marshal Crawford had failed to obtain warrant, had accepted uncorroborated accusation from Marcus Webb without verifying whether fugitive Robert Mitchell existed, had organized raid based on personal favor to Webb, who'd hoped to use law enforcement for harassing neighbor, who'd defeated him in boundary dispute litigation. The investigation's findings created unprecedented dilemma for territorial government. Carl had killed 23 officers, but had done so defending property from illegal raid that constitutional protections had prohibited. Prosecuting him for defensive killings might be impossible when officers had violated Fourth Amendment requirements, and when Carl could argue he'd reasonably believed he was defending against criminal attack rather than legitimate law enforcement operation. Governor consulted with Territorial Attorney General about whether prosecution was appropriate given circumstances, received advice that constitutional violations by officers created reasonable doubt about whether Carl's killings had been criminal or justified homicide, when defenders of homes have right to resist illegal invasions even when intruders are government officials conducting operations without proper legal authorization. Territorial government decided against prosecution in January 1890, issued statement acknowledging that raid had been conducted without warrant in violation of constitutional requirements, concluded that Carl's defensive actions had been justified response to illegal invasion and that officers' deaths had been caused by Marshal Crawford's failures to follow proper legal procedures rather than by criminal conduct from Homestead defending property. The decision was controversial among law enforcement community, who argued that allowing officer killings to go unpunished would encourage resistance to legitimate operations, but constitutional scholars and civil liberties advocates supported decision as appropriate recognition that even government officials face consequences when violating constitutional protections that exist specifically to prevent authorities from conducting arbitrary raids without judicial oversight. Marcus Webb was prosecuted for filing false complaint that had led to 23 deaths. Convicted in March 1890, of multiple counts including perjury and conspiracy to violate civil rights, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, representing harshest penalty ever imposed for false accusations that had resulted in law enforcement casualties. Webb's prosecution and conviction sent message that using authorities as weapons for personal disputes carried serious consequences, that individuals who manipulated law enforcement for private vendettas would be held accountable when their lies resulted in deaths that proper verification would have prevented. Carl Isaacs continued living on Homestead through remaining years, died in 1921 at age 73, heart attack taking him while working on property he'd defended through systematic elimination of 23 officers who'd conducted illegal raid. His obituary in territorial newspapers mentioned he'd been homesteader and veteran of 1889 incident where officers had died during warrantless raid, carefully worded description that acknowledged defensive killings without characterizing them as criminal acts when territorial government's decision not to prosecute had effectively determined that Carl's actions had been justified homicide rather than murder. The legacy persists in debates about constitutional protections and limits of law enforcement authority, about whether killing 23 officers could be justified when they'd conducted warrantless raid based on false accusation, about what happens when authorities violate constitutional requirements and when individuals defending homes view illegal government operations as indistinguishable from criminal attacks deserving resistance. The Mountain Survivor case demonstrated that constitutional protections create limits on government power, that even law enforcement officers must respect, that violating Fourth Amendment requirements can result in defensive violence that individuals have legal right to employ when protecting property from invasions that lack judicial authorization, regardless of whether intruders are criminals or government officials conducting illegal operations. The immediate aftermath of territorial government's decision not to prosecute Carl Isaacs created unprecedented situation throughout Montana Territory, where homesteader who'd killed 23 law enforcement officers lived openly on property that defensive campaign had protected from illegal raid, where government's acknowledgement that warrantless operation had violated constitutional requirements meant that defensive killings had been classified as justified homicide rather than murder, despite extraordinary body count that exceeded any previous civilian resistance to law enforcement in American history. The decision sent shockwaves through territorial law enforcement community, officers understanding that conducting operations without proper warrants could result in defensive violence, that government would decline to prosecute when constitutional violations had been so egregious that defendants could argue legitimate belief that they'd been resisting criminal attacks rather than complying with legitimate authority. Carl's life after November 1889 siege was marked by isolation, intensifying beyond what 12 previous years had established. Homesteader, who'd already distrusted society after watching father's wrongful execution, now understood that authorities would conduct illegal raids based on false accusations and would refuse to withdraw even after losing multiple officers, rather than admitting mistakes that pride prevented acknowledging. Carl maintained homestead operations, continued subsistence farming and hunting and trapping that had sustained him since 1877 arrival, avoided contact with outside world beyond minimal trading necessary for obtaining supplies that Montana wilderness couldn't provide, created existence defined by self-sufficiency and by conviction that legal systems couldn't be trusted to protect innocent people from either wrongful convictions or from illegal government operations. But Carl also became involuntary symbol throughout Western territories, where homesteaders and miners and ranchers viewed his defensive success as vindication of constitutional principles that frontier law enforcement frequently ignored when conducting operations in regions where isolation and limited oversight created opportunities for abuses that urban jurisdictions' greater accountability would have prevented. Stories about Mountain Survivor, who'd single-handedly defeated 23 federal marshals, spread throughout Montana and neighboring territories, embellished through retelling until separating actual events from legend became impossible for those who hadn't witnessed aftermath, or who didn't know details that territorial investigation had documented. The legends emphasized tactical sophistication and terrain advantages that had enabled one man to systematically eliminate officers who'd underestimated defensive capabilities of homesteader defending property from illegal invasion. Marcus Webb's imprisonment for 20 years, following conviction on charges of filing false complaint that had resulted in 23 deaths, represented unprecedented accountability for individual whose lies had manipulated law enforcement into conducting operation that constitutional requirements had prohibited. Webb was transferred to federal prison in Kansas, harsh environment, where other inmates included violent criminals, whose contempt for informants who'd caused law enforcement casualties meant that Webb faced constant threats, requiring protective custody, separating him from general population. Webb's lawyer appealed conviction, arguing that sentence was excessive punishment for false accusations that hadn't directly caused deaths. Actually, Marshal Crawford's decision to conduct warrantless raid and to refuse retreat after initial casualties had been proximate causes, but appeals courts affirmed conviction and sentence in 1891, finding that Webb's perjury had been essential element triggering chain of events culminating in 23 deaths that proper verification would have prevented. Webb served 13 years before dying in prison in 1903 at age 58, pneumonia taking him during Kansas winter, that prison's inadequate heating had made particularly dangerous for inmates in compromised health. His death represented final chapter in boundary dispute that had escalated from property disagreement to false accusations to law enforcement massacre to lengthy imprisonment, demonstrated that manipulating authorities for personal vendettas carried consequences that extended beyond immediate legal penalties when resulting deaths created legacy of accountability that outlived participants in original conflict. Federal law enforcement policies changed significantly following 1889 Montana Raid U.S. Marshals Service implementing new requirements that warrants must be obtained before conducting raids in territorial regions, that complaints from sources with conflicts of interest must be verified independently before organizing operations, that commanders must establish retreat protocols, preventing situations where pride prevents withdrawing from operations that tactical circumstances make impossible to complete successfully. The policy changes were direct response to Montana massacre, acknowledgement that constitutional protections existed for important reasons, and that violating Fourth Amendment requirements could result in officer casualties that proper procedures would prevent. But policy changes also generated controversy within law enforcement community, officers arguing that requiring warrants and verification would delay responses to time-sensitive situations where fugitives might escape or evidence might be destroyed, that territorial conditions required flexibility about procedures that urban jurisdictions could follow more strictly without compromising operational effectiveness. The debate reflected fundamental tension between constitutional protections and law enforcement efficiency, question of whether preventing abuses like Montana Raid justified procedural requirements that might occasionally allow criminals to evade capture when actually constitutional framers had decided that protecting innocent people from government overreach was more important than maximizing law enforcement success rates. Carl maintained correspondence with civil liberties attorney Robert Morrison, who'd written him in 1890, expressing support for defensive actions and offering legal assistance if territorial government reversed decision not to prosecute. Morrison represented growing movement of constitutional scholars and attorneys who viewed Carl's case as important precedent, establishing that individuals could resist illegal government operations through force when authorities violated Fourth Amendment requirements, that defensive killings during warrantless raids could be justified homicide when reasonable persons would have believed they were defending against criminal attacks rather than complying with legitimate authority. Morrison visited Carl's homestead in 1892, spent week documenting detailed account of November 1889 siege for legal treatise. He was writing about constitutional limits on government power, published The Montana Massacre. Constitutional protections and defensive violence against illegal government operations. In 1893, that became foundational text in constitutional law examining when individuals could legitimately resist authorities through force. Morrison's treatise analyzed Carl's defensive campaign in tactical detail, explained how terrain advantages and tactical sophistication had enabled a single individual to defeat 23 officers, argued that success demonstrated that even government with overwhelming resources couldn't subjugate population when constitutional protections gave individuals legitimate right to defend homes from illegal invasions. The treatise was controversial among legal scholars, some arguing that Morrison was glorifying violence against law enforcement and that encouraging resistance to authorities would undermine social order regardless of whether specific operations violated constitutional requirements. But constitutional scholars generally supported Morrison's analysis, recognized that Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches depended on individuals having meaningful ability to resist when authorities conducted illegal operations, that defensive violence was logical consequence of government violating constitutional limits that existed specifically to prevent arbitrary exercises of power. Carl's father's wrongful execution in Missouri gained renewed attention in 1895, when Carl's brother Thomas published confession explaining that he'd committed murder that father had been executed for in 1874, that he'd allowed father to be convicted because he'd been 17 years old and terrified of facing death penalty himself, that guilt about father's execution had consumed him for 21 years before he could finally acknowledge truth. Thomas's confession couldn't reverse execution that had occurred 2 decades previously, but it provided definitive proof that Carl's distrust of legal systems had been justified by actual experience watching innocent father die because prosecutors had prioritized convictions over truth and because appeals courts had deferred to jury verdicts despite reasonable doubts. The Missouri confession generated national media coverage, connecting Carl's defensive actions in Montana to childhood trauma of watching father's wrongful execution, created narrative presenting mountain survivor as man whose entire adult life had been shaped by judicial failures. First watching legal system kill innocent father, then defending home from illegal raid by authorities who'd violated same constitutional protections that should have prevented father's wrongful conviction. The narrative made Carl into symbol transcending specific Montana incident, representing broader American distrust of government power and legal systems that too frequently failed to protect innocent people from prosecutorial misconduct and from law enforcement operations conducted without proper authorization. Carl remained on Homestead through subsequent decades, maintaining isolation that November 1889 siege had reinforced by demonstrating that even remote mountain property couldn't provide complete protection from authorities willing to conduct illegal operations based on false accusations. He aged alone, never marrying or establishing family, despite occasional visitors who made pilgrimages to meet legendary mountain survivor whose defensive success had been chronicled in Morrison's treatise and in countless newspaper articles examining constitutional implications of killing 23 officers during warrantless raid. Carl Isaacs died February 14, 1921, at age 73, massive heart attack, taking him while splitting firewood on property he'd defended for 44 years, including 3-day siege that had killed every officer who'd participated in illegal raid. His body wasn't discovered for 3 weeks. Isolation that had protected him from society also meant that death went unnoticed until mail carrier attempting delivery found cabin locked and investigated through window revealing Carl's body. Territorial authorities organized funeral attended by over 400 people from throughout Montana, testament to legendary status he'd achieved as constitutional defender, who'd proven that individuals could successfully resist government overreach when authorities violated protections that founders had created specifically to limit federal power. Multiple speakers delivered eulogies celebrating Carl as symbol of American liberty, man who defended not just personal property, but constitutional principles that government officials too frequently violated when conducting operations in regions where oversight was limited and where authorities believed frontier conditions exempted them from legal requirements. Robert Morrison delivered final eulogy describing Carl as living embodiment of Second Amendment's purpose, armed citizen capable of resisting tyranny, whether from foreign invasion or from domestic authorities conducting operations without constitutional authorization, proving that founders' wisdom in protecting gun ownership extended beyond protection from external threats to include defense against government overreach that constitutional protections were designed to prevent. Carl was buried in small cemetery near Homestead. Simple gravestone listing name and dates alongside inscription reading, "Mountain survivor defended home and constitution against illegal government invasion, November 1889." The inscription was deliberately crafted to emphasize constitutional dimensions of defensive campaign, to frame 23 officer deaths as consequence of government's failures rather than as criminal violence from anti-authority extremist, to establish legacy that Carl's actions had been principled defense of rights rather than lawless resistance to legitimate authority. Visitors to grave became regular occurrence through subsequent decades, constitutional scholars and civil liberties advocates, and ordinary citizens who viewed Carl as hero, defending liberties that government constantly threatened through expanding powers and through conducting operations that constitutional framers would have recognized as exactly the kind of arbitrary searches that Fourth Amendment was designed to prohibit. The pilgrimage reflected broader American ambivalence about government authority, recognition that while law enforcement was necessary for maintaining social order, unchecked power inevitably led to abuses that constitutional protections existed to prevent, but that individuals might need to resist through force when authorities violated those protections. The 21st century brought renewed interest in Carl's story when documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination of November 1889 siege, film titled Mountain Survivor, The Constitutional Defense of Carl Isaacs, featuring interviews with historians, constitutional scholars, descendants of 23 dead officers, expressing various perspectives on whether defensive killings had been justified or whether Carl should have been prosecuted regardless of constitutional violations that had triggered siege. Documentary presented most balanced account possible given competing narratives, acknowledged both government's egregious Fourth Amendment violation and extraordinary violence that had killed 23 officers, including some who'd privately expressed doubts about raid, but had participated because refusing orders would have ended careers. Most powerful segment featured newly discovered journals from 3 officers who died during siege, documents that had been preserved by families but that hadn't been made public until descendants donated materials to Montana Historical Society in 2018. Journals revealed that several officers had questioned whether Marshal Crawford had obtained warrant, had expressed concerns about conducting raid based solely on Marcus Webb's uncorroborated accusations, had participated reluctantly in operation they'd believed was legally questionable, but that refusing would have been insubordination punishable by termination. The journal's complicated narrative presenting all officers as equally culpable for constitutional violation. Several had been following orders they'd questioned, but couldn't refuse without sacrificing careers, had died during operation they'd privately opposed, but hadn't possessed authority to prevent. Documentary also examined modern parallels to 1889 siege, compared Carl's defensive actions to contemporary debates about no-knock raids and qualified immunity and police militarization, interviewed legal scholars arguing that Carl's case established precedent that individuals could resist illegal government operations through force, but that modern interpretations had narrowed that right through judicial decisions, granting law enforcement officers immunity for constitutional violations unless rights violated were clearly established through previous cases, creating standard that prevented accountability even when officers conducted operations without proper authorization. Rebecca Crawford, great-great-granddaughter of Marshal James Crawford, who'd organized raid and who died during final assault November 5, 1889, appeared in documentary expressing complicated feelings about ancestor whose constitutional violation had resulted in his death and deaths of 22 other officers. Rebecca described discovering through family documents that James had been warned by territorial judge that conducting raid without warrant was illegal, that he'd proceeded anyway believing that frontier conditions justified flexibility about constitutional requirements. that his pride and refusal to retreat after initial casualties had transformed single illegal operation into massacre that proper procedures would have prevented entirely. Rebecca's participation was courageous acknowledgement that celebrating ancestors required confronting their failures rather than sanitizing through heroic narratives, that James Crawford's legacy was cautionary tale about dangers of law enforcement overreach rather than story of brave marshal dying in line of duty. Her honesty created space for more nuanced evaluation of November 1889 events, recognition that tragedy had resulted from multiple failures, including Crawford's constitutional violation and his tactical incompetence and his refusal to withdraw when continuation guaranteed additional casualties. That assigning responsibility required acknowledging systemic problems beyond individual homesteaders' defensive violence. Montana established historical marker at site of Carl's homestead in 2020, plaque acknowledging November 1889 siege while attempting to balance competing narratives about whether defensive killings had been justified or whether 23 officer deaths represented tragedy, that constitutional protections hadn't prevented despite their importance in limiting government power. Marker text explained that Carl Isaacs killed 23 U.S. Marshals and territorial deputies during three-day siege November 1889, defending Homestead from warrantless raid organized by Marshal James Crawford based on false accusation from neighbor Marcus Webb. Territorial government declined prosecution, determining defensive killings were justified homicide when officers violated Fourth Amendment requirements. Several officers who died had privately questioned raids' legality, but participated following orders they couldn't refuse without career consequences. This site reminds us that constitutional protections require vigilance from both government officials, who must follow proper procedures, and from citizens who may need to defend rights when authorities violate constitutional limits. That 1889 tragedy resulted from multiple failures, including illegal raid, false accusations, and refusal to retreat. And that modern debates about law enforcement authority and individual rights to resist government overreach continue confronting questions that Montana Massacre raised about when defensive violence against authorities becomes justified response to constitutional violations. By 2024, Carl Isaacs remained controversial figure in debates about government power and constitutional limits. Second Amendment advocates celebrating him as exemplar of armed citizen capable of resisting tyranny, while civil liberties scholars recognized complexity that journals from dead officers had revealed. Defensive campaign had killed people who'd privately opposed operation, but hadn't possessed authority to prevent raid that commanding officer had organized in violation of constitutional requirements. The competing perspectives reflected fundamental tension in American political culture, between celebrating resistance to government overreach and acknowledging that individuals resisting authorities might kill people who weren't personally responsible for violations that had triggered defensive violence. Legal scholars examining Carl's case in contemporary context debated whether modern interpretations of Fourth Amendment had strengthened or weakened protections that 1889 territorial government had recognized when declining to prosecute defensive killings, whether qualified immunity doctrine had created environment where individuals couldn't practically resist illegal operations, because courts would likely determine that officers conducting raids without warrants weren't violating clearly established rights unless specific circumstances exactly matched previous cases. The debate revealed that Carl's precedent of successful resistance to warrantless raid might not apply in contemporary legal environment, where doctrines protecting law enforcement from accountability had evolved in ways that constitutional framers likely wouldn't have endorsed. Most controversial modern parallel involved comparing Carl's defensive actions to Black Lives Matter movement's critiques of police violence and qualified immunity. Scholars arguing that if white homesteader in 1889 could kill 23 officers without prosecution when defending property from warrantless raid, modern protesters' demands for accountability when officers killed unarmed civilians during questionable operations were modest in comparison. They sought prosecutions and civil liability rather than employing defensive violence that Carl's case suggested might be constitutionally protected when authorities violated Fourth Amendment protections. The comparison was politically charged. Conservatives who celebrated Karl often opposing police accountability movements, while progressives who supported those movements sometimes felt uncomfortable celebrating white man who'd killed officers even when government had acknowledged defensive necessity. Historical marker at Karl's grave was supplemented in 2023 with additional plaque acknowledging officers who died during siege, listing 23 names alongside explanation that these men died conducting operation without proper warrant, several having privately questioned raids' legality but lacking authority to prevent commanders' constitutional violation. Their deaths remind us that law enforcement officers face consequences when superiors order illegal operations, and that following orders doesn't absolve individuals from responsibility for participating in activities that violate constitutional protections they've sworn to defend. The supplemental marker attempted to honor officers while acknowledging their complicity in constitutional violation, to recognize that several had died reluctantly, participating in operation they'd opposed, but that refusing would have required career sacrifices that human weakness had made too difficult to accept. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of constitutional defense across 135 years, the warrantless raid that violated Fourth Amendment protections by accepting false accusation without verification, the single homesteader's systematic elimination of 23 officers during 3-day siege defending property from illegal government invasion, the territorial government's unprecedented decision that defensive killings were justified homicide when authorities had violated constitutional requirements, the journals revealing that several officers had privately questioned raids' legality but had participated following orders they couldn't refuse without career consequences. The impossible questions about whether killing 23 people could be justified, even when they'd conducted illegal operation, and whether officers following questionable orders deserve same accountability as commanders who organized constitutional violations. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how constitutional protections create tensions between government authority and individual rights to resist when officials violate legal requirements that acknowledge both egregious Fourth Amendment violation and extraordinary violence killing officers, including some who'd opposed operation privately, that demonstrate how frontier justice sometimes recognized principles that modern qualified immunity doctrine has eroded through protecting law enforcement from accountability even when conducting operations without proper authorization. Comment about whether Karl's defensive actions represent heroic constitutional defense or whether killing 23 officers exceeded proportional response even when raid was illegal, whether modern interpretations of Fourth Amendment have strengthened or weakened protections that 1889 territorial government recognized by declining prosecution, whether officers following orders to conduct warrantless raids deserve accountability, or whether responsibility lies solely with commanders who organize illegal operations. Because these questions persist wherever government power confronts individual rights, wherever law enforcement conducts operations without proper authorization, wherever constitutional protections that founders created to limit federal authority face erosion through doctrines protecting officials from accountability, wherever citizens must decide whether resisting illegal government actions justifies violence or whether compliance with even unconstitutional orders is necessary for maintaining social order that prevents descent into chaos, where everyone claims justification for killing authorities they believe are violating rights. Until next time, remember that Karl Isaacs killed 23 officers defending Homestead from warrantless raid based on false accusation, that territorial government declined prosecution determining defensive killings were justified homicide, that journals revealed several officers had privately opposed operation, but participated following orders, that modern debates about qualified immunity and police accountability continue confronting questions about when individuals can legitimately resist government overreach through force, and that ultimately constitutional protections mean nothing if individuals lack practical ability to defend rights when authorities violate legal requirements that exist specifically to prevent arbitrary exercises of power that founders recognized would inevitably occur without meaningful limits on government authority. The most dramatic chapter in Karl Isaacs' legacy began in January 2019 when Federal Appeals Court in Kentucky examined case involving homeowner Marcus Thompson, who'd shot and killed 3 police officers during no-knock raid at his apartment. Thompson's attorneys arguing that Carl Isaac's precedent from 1889 Montana established that individuals could resist illegal law enforcement operations through lethal force when officers violated Fourth Amendment requirements by conducting raids without proper authorization. Thompson case presented modern equivalent of Carl's situation. Police had raided wrong address based on outdated warrant listing apartment that drug dealer had vacated months earlier. Officers had broken down door at 2 a.m. without announcing themselves. Thompson had grabbed legally owned firearm believing home invasion was occurring and had fired defensively, killing 3 officers before discovering they were police conducting what turned out to be mistaken raid on innocent person's residence. Lower courts had convicted Thompson of murdering police officers, rejected argument that mistaken raid created self-defense justification when officers had been conducting legitimate law enforcement operation even if they targeted wrong address. But appeals court panel examining case in 2019 discovered Carl Isaac's precedent through legal research into historical cases where individuals had successfully defended against prosecution for killing law enforcement officers. Found Montana territorial government's 1890 decision that warrantless raid justified defensive killings as potential support for Thompson's claim that mistaken raid on wrong address created reasonable belief he was defending against criminal attack rather than complying with legitimate authority. Appeals court ordered new trial in March 2019, ruling that jury instructions should have included explanation of Carl Isaac's precedent and that Thompson's attorneys should have been permitted to argue that even if officers were conducting legitimate operation from their perspective, homeowner who reasonably believed he was defending against home invasion could employ lethal force without criminal liability when mistakes by authorities created situation where innocent person couldn't distinguish between criminal attack and police raid. The ruling was unprecedented application of 130-year-old Montana case to contemporary law enforcement context, suggested that Carl's defensive actions had established principle that extended beyond specific circumstances of warrantless raid to include situations where government mistakes created reasonable belief that illegal invasion was occurring. Federal prosecutors appealed to Supreme Court in April 2019, arguing that allowing Carl Isaac's precedent to justify defensive killings during mistaken police raids would create impossible environment for law enforcement, that officers conducting operations based on warrants or probable cause couldn't effectively perform duties if citizens could kill them with impunity whenever mistakes resulted in raids on wrong addresses or wrong individuals. Government's petition emphasized that Carl's case had involved deliberately warrantless raid based on knowingly false accusation, much more egregious violation than honest mistakes that sometimes occurred during legitimate operations, and that extending precedent beyond extreme constitutional violations like 1889 Montana raid would undermine law enforcement's ability to conduct necessary operations, that inevitably included occasional errors. But civil liberties organizations filed amicus briefs supporting Thompson, arguing that Carl Isaac's precedent established fundamental principle that individuals had right to defend homes from government intrusions when circumstances made it impossible to distinguish between legitimate authority and criminal attack. That qualified immunity doctrine had eroded constitutional protections to point where Montana territorial government's 1890 decision represented stronger safeguards for individual rights than contemporary legal standards provided. ACLU's brief specifically noted that if 1889 Homesteader could kill 23 officers without prosecution when defending against warrantless raid, modern homeowner who killed 3 officers during mistaken raid on wrong address deserved at minimum the opportunity to present self-defense argument to jury, rather than having defense rejected through jury instructions that categorically prohibited considering whether reasonable belief about home invasion justified defensive violence. Supreme Court granted certiorari in June 2019. Scheduled oral arguments for October 2019 created national debate about whether Carl's defensive actions should influence contemporary law about resisting law enforcement during raids where government mistakes or constitutional violations made it impossible for citizens to distinguish between legitimate authority and criminal attacks. The case became cause célèbre among Second Amendment advocates, who viewed Karl as exemplar of armed citizenship, defending against government overreach, among police organizations who argued that extending Karl's precedent to modern context would result in officer deaths during legitimate operations that occasionally included mistakes, that tragic but unavoidable consequences of law enforcement work. Montana Attorney General filed amicus brief in August 2019 documenting history of Karl Isaac's case, explained that territorial government's decision not to prosecute had been based on extraordinary circumstances, including deliberately warrantless raid, false accusations from source with obvious conflict of interest, refusal by Marshal Crawford to withdraw after initial casualties, demonstrated illegal operation was encountering resistance, cumulative constitutional violations that created situation fundamentally different from modern mistaken raid, where officers had warrant and had attempted to execute it properly, even though address was wrong due to outdated information. Montana's brief argued that Karl's precedent shouldn't apply to Thompson case because circumstances weren't comparable. 1889 raid had involved multiple egregious violations, while 2019 raid had involved single tragic mistake during otherwise legitimate operation. But Thompson's attorneys countered that distinguishing between types of government mistakes was impossible from citizens' perspective during raid, whether officers lacked warrant or had wrong address. Homeowner experiencing forced entry at 2 a.m. couldn't reasonably determine whether intruders were legitimate authority or criminals. That defensive violence was justified whenever government's failures created reasonable belief that criminal attack was occurring. Their brief emphasized that Karl had fired first, without attempting to determine whether attackers were law enforcement, that if waiting to confirm identities before defending was required, then Karl should have been prosecuted for killing officers before knowing they were marshals rather than criminals. That Montana territorial government's decision meant constitutional protections included right to defend first and determine attacker identities later, when circumstances made advanced determination impossible. Supreme Court oral arguments in October 2019 featured intense questioning about implications of applying Karl's precedent to contemporary context. Justice Elena Kagan asking whether ruling for Thompson would mean that every mistaken police raid could result in officer deaths without criminal consequences for shooters, whether law enforcement could function effectively if citizens could kill officers with impunity, whenever government mistakes created situations where authority couldn't be immediately identified. Thompson's attorney responded that alternative was requiring citizens to submit to violent home invasions whenever intruders claimed to be police, that Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches were meaningless if individuals couldn't defend homes when government conducted operations that from citizens' perspective appeared indistinguishable from criminal attacks. Justice Neil Gorsuch raised different concern, asking whether qualified immunity doctrine had created situation where government could conduct raids without accountability for mistakes while simultaneously prosecuting citizens who defended themselves during those raids, where the combination of protecting officers from civil liability while prosecuting homeowners for defensive violence had eliminated practical effect of constitutional protections that Karl Isaac's case demonstrated territorial government had once recognized. Government attorneys struggled to explain why 1889 Montana had declined prosecution for killing 23 officers during warrantless raid, while 2019 Kentucky was prosecuting homeowner who'd killed 3 officers during mistaken raid, when both situations involved government failures creating reasonable belief that illegal invasions were occurring. Supreme Court decision issued in June 2020 was fractured 5-4, ruling that technically affirmed Thompson's conviction, but included multiple concurring and dissenting opinions revealing deep divisions about Karl's precedent and its application to modern context. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote narrow majority opinion, holding that Karl Isaac's case was distinguishable, because 1889 raid had involved deliberately warrantless operation based on knowingly false accusation, constitutional violations so egregious that defensive killings were justified, while 2019 raid had involved honest mistake during legitimate operation where officers had warrant even though. Address was wrong, that extending Carl's precedent to include all government mistakes would create unworkable standard preventing effective law enforcement. But Justice Clarence Thomas wrote separate concurrence arguing that Montana territorial government's rationale had been that individuals could resist illegal government operations when circumstances created reasonable belief that criminal attacks were occurring, that whether violations were deliberate or mistaken was irrelevant from homeowners' perspective during forced entry at 2 a.m., that limiting Carl's precedent to only egregious constitutional violations meant that Fourth Amendment protections were effectively eliminated for vast majority of government mistakes that were characterized as honest errors rather than deliberate violations. Thomas's concurrence suggested he believed Thompson should have been acquitted under proper application of Carl's precedent, but was constrained by majority's narrower reading. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote passionate dissent, joined by Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, and Kagan, arguing that majority's distinction between deliberate violations and honest mistakes was incoherent because homeowners couldn't distinguish between types of government failures during raids, that Carl Isaac's precedent established fundamental principle that defensive violence was justified whenever government created situations where citizens couldn't reasonably determine whether they were being attacked by criminals or by authorities conducting illegal or mistaken operations. Sotomayor's dissent emphasized that qualified immunity doctrine had already eliminated civil accountability for government mistakes, that majority's ruling completed erosion of Fourth Amendment protections by eliminating both civil and criminal accountability while simultaneously prosecuting citizens who defended themselves. That result was constitutional framework founders wouldn't have recognized, and that Montana territorial government had rejected when declining to prosecute Carl, despite killing 23 officers. The Supreme Court decision generated immediate controversy. Second Amendment advocates and civil liberties organizations both criticizing majority for distinguishing Carl's precedent in ways that eliminated practical protections against government overreach, law enforcement organizations praising decision as appropriate limitation that prevented extending 130-year-old frontier case to contemporary context where mistakes during legitimate operations shouldn't result in officer deaths without criminal consequences for shooters. The division reflected fundamental disagreement about whether constitutional protections should adapt to modern law enforcement needs or whether founding principles required maintaining rights to resist government operations when circumstances made distinguishing legitimate authority from criminal attacks impossible, regardless of whether government failures were deliberate or mistaken. Most significant consequence of Supreme Court decision was explosion of academic and popular interest in Carl Isaac's case, legal scholars examining Montana territorial government's 1890 decision in unprecedented detail, discovering additional documentation that complicated both celebratory narratives presenting Carl as constitutional hero and critical perspectives arguing his defensive violence had exceeded proportional response even to illegal raid. National Archives research conducted in 2020 discovered that Territorial Attorney General Thomas Morrison, no relation to Robert Morrison who'd written 1893 treatise, had prepared detailed legal memorandum explaining rationale for declining prosecution, memorandum that hadn't been publicly available, until archival digitization project made historical documents accessible to researchers. Morrison's memorandum revealed that decision not to prosecute had been controversial within territorial government. Governor and several advisors had wanted to pursue charges arguing that killing 23 officers couldn't be tolerated regardless of constitutional violations that had triggered defensive violence, that Montana Territory's reputation and ability to attract settlers and investment would be damaged by perception that homesteaders could massacre law enforcement without consequences. But Morrison had convinced Governor that prosecution would likely fail because jury of Montana residents would almost certainly acquit homeowner defending property from warrantless raid, that failed prosecution would be worse for territorial government's reputation than acknowledging that officers' constitutional violations had made defensive killings justified homicide that couldn't be successfully prosecuted. Memorandum also documented that Morrison had been troubled by number of officers killed, had written that, while defensive necessity justified initial resistance to illegal invasion, continued killing of 23 officers over a 3-day period raises questions about whether proportional response had been exceeded when retreat by government forces should have been permitted, rather than systematically eliminating every officer who'd participated in original raid. Morrison's concerns suggested that even Attorney General, who'd ultimately decided against prosecution, had believed Carl's defensive violence had potentially crossed line from justified resistance to excessive retaliation, that declining prosecution had been pragmatic calculation about likelihood of conviction, rather than endorsement of all defensive actions as legally appropriate. Discovery of Morrison's memorandum generated renewed debate about Carl's legacy, critics arguing that even Territorial Attorney General who'd declined prosecution had questioned whether killing all 23 officers had been necessary when allowing retreat after initial defensive success would have protected property without eliminating every participant in illegal raid. Defenders countered that Morrison's concerns were speculative. Crawford had refused to retreat despite suffering casualties. Carl couldn't have known whether allowing survivors to withdraw would have resulted in additional raid attempts or in prosecution for initial killings that had already occurred. That proportionality analysis was inappropriate when government attackers had refused to cease illegal operation despite clear defensive resistance. The memorandum also revealed previously unknown fact that several officers' families had petitioned territorial government to prosecute Carl, argued that regardless of constitutional violations, their husbands and fathers hadn't personally organized warrantless raid and had been following orders from superior officer, that defensive killings had destroyed families who'd lost breadwinners to violence that legal system's decision not to prosecute meant would never be acknowledged as criminal or receive any accountability. Families' petition had been particularly moving because it included letters from widows describing economic devastation and from children describing losing fathers to violence that territorial government's decision meant would be characterized as justified homicide rather than recognized as murders deserving prosecution. Petition had included testimony from widow of Deputy Marshal William Harrison, who'd been killed during November 4th assault, documented that William had written letter to wife night before fatal attack expressing doubts about raid, and describing how he'd told Crawford that operation should be suspended until warrant could be obtained, that William had participated in final assault only because refusing direct order would have resulted in termination, and that family needed income that Marshal Service provided. The letter directly corroborated journals that had been discovered in 2018, provided additional evidence that several officers killed by Carl had privately opposed raid, but had participated because career consequences of refusing had been too severe to accept. Montana Historical Society published complete collection of documents related to Carl Isaac's case in 2021, comprehensive volume titled The Montana Massacre, complete records of the 1889 siege and its legal aftermath, that included Morrison's memorandum, officers' families' petition, newly discovered correspondence between territorial officials debating whether prosecution should proceed, transcripts from investigation that had examined raid's causes and circumstances. The publication made Carl's case accessible to researchers and general public in unprecedented detail, enabled examination of complexities that simplified narratives, whether celebratory or critical, had overlooked through focusing on constitutional issues without fully considering human costs that defensive campaign had imposed on families who'd lost members to violence that government had ultimately decided was justified. Publication generated renewed controversy when historians discovered that one of 23 officers killed had been Marcus Thompson, recently arrived deputy who'd been working for Marshal Service for only 3 weeks when he'd participated in his first raid that proved to be fatal operation. Thompson had been 22 years old, had written to parents in Ohio describing excitement about new position and about Montana Territory's beauty, had no knowledge of conflict between Carl and Marcus Webb or of Crawford's decision to conduct raid without warrant, had simply been following first orders he'd received as new deputy that superior officers had characterized as routine fugitive apprehension. Thompson's youth and inexperience made his death particularly tragic, suggested that Carl's defensive violence had killed officer who bore minimal responsibility for constitutional violations that had motivated raid. Discovery prompted searches for information about all 23 officers, revealed that at least 6 had been serving for less than 6 months when they'd participated in November 1889 raid, that several had been recruited specifically for operation because Crawford had needed additional personnel and had promised substantial payment for participants in what he'd characterized as important fugitive apprehension that would be quick operation resulting in arrest or death of wanted criminal. The recruitment of inexperienced deputies suggested that Crawford had anticipated resistance and had wanted expendable personnel who wouldn't question orders from superior officer. That systematic elimination campaign had killed officers who'd been deliberately selected because their inexperience made them unlikely to challenge illegal operation that veterans might have recognized as constitutional violation. But defenders of Carl's legacy argued that assessing individual officers' culpability was impossible during defensive campaign, that Carl had no way of knowing which officers had organized raid versus which were following orders, which were veterans understanding constitutional violations versus which were inexperienced recruits believing they were conducting legitimate operation. That defensive violence during illegal invasion couldn't be expected to discriminate between aggressors based on their internal knowledge or intentions when external actions were indistinguishable. The argument emphasized that government bore responsibility for placing inexperienced officers in situation where constitutional violations by commanders would result in their deaths, that Carl couldn't be expected to evaluate individual culpability while defending against armed attackers, conducting what from his perspective appeared to be criminal assault on his property. By 2024, Carl Isaacs remained most contested figure in debates about constitutional limits on government power and about individual rights to resist illegal operations through defensive violence. Montana established expanded educational center at site of former Homestead. Comprehensive museum documenting November 1889 siege through multiple perspectives, including Carl's defensive rationale, officers' families' losses, territorial government's legal reasoning. Contemporary debates about whether precedent should influence modern law enforcement accountability. Museum presented most balanced historical account possible, refused to characterize Carl as unambiguous hero or as criminal whose violence exceeded defensive necessity, acknowledged that reasonable people could disagree about whether killing 23 officers was justified, even when raid had violated constitutional requirements. Central exhibit featured side-by-side displays, contrasting Carl's perspective with perspectives of officers who died. Visitors could read Carl's journal describing siege as defense against illegal invasion, requiring systematic elimination of all attackers to prevent additional raids or prosecution for initial defensive killings. Then could read letters from officers describing raid as legitimate fugitive apprehension that had encountered unexpected resistance from Homesteader, whose tactical capabilities had been underestimated by Crawford's planning. The exhibit included audio presentations featuring historians arguing competing positions, some maintaining that Carl's violence was justified constitutional defense, while others contended that proportional response would have been initial resistance, followed by allowing retreat rather than systematically eliminating all 23 officers over a 3-day period. Museum also featured interactive displays exploring modern parallels. Visitors could examine Thompson case and Supreme Court decision, could read Morrison's memorandum expressing concerns about proportionality, could view officers' families' petition requesting prosecution, could engage with competing interpretations about whether Carl's precedent should influence contemporary law, or whether 1889 frontier conditions created unique circumstances that shouldn't determine modern standards for resisting law enforcement during raids that involve government mistakes or constitutional violations. The museum refused to provide definitive answers, instead presented materials allowing visitors to evaluate for themselves whether Carl's defensive actions represented heroic constitutional defense or tragic violence that killed people who bore varying degrees of responsibility for illegal raid. Most powerful exhibit was memorial room listing all 23 officers' names, ages, lengths of service, family circumstances, displaying photographs where available, providing biographical information, showing that men who died during siege were individuals with families and hopes and lives, rather than abstract representatives of government overreach. Memorial included audio recordings from descendants of officers expressing diverse perspectives, some condemning Karl as murderer who should have been prosecuted, others acknowledging that ancestors had participated in illegal operation and bore responsibility for consequences that constitutional violations had triggered, some maintaining that regardless of legality, their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had been following orders and had died in service deserving honor even if superiors had organized operation improperly. Museum's final exhibit examined question that Karl's case raised about constitutional protection's practical meaning. Memorial wall posed question, what do constitutional limits on government power mean if citizens cannot resist when authorities violate those limits? Alongside competing responses from legal scholars, law enforcement professionals, civil liberties advocates, ordinary citizens whose perspectives ranged from celebrating Karl as defender of rights to condemning him as cop killer, whose violence exceeded any defensive justification. The exhibit provided no resolution, instead concluded that Karl Isaac's case forces Americans to confront tensions between government authority and individual rights that founders recognized would be permanent features of constitutional system, that balancing effective law enforcement with protections against government overreach requires ongoing debates about limits that reasonable people will always disagree about, because no answer can simultaneously maximize both security and liberty. If this final expanded act made you grapple with ultimate complexity of constitutional defense across 135 years, the Supreme Court case attempting to apply Karl's precedent to modern mistaken raid, revealing that even court itself was divided about whether 1889 decision established principles extending beyond specific circumstances of deliberately warrantless operation, the discovered memorandum showing that even territorial attorney general, who declined prosecution, had questioned whether killing all 23 officers exceeded proportional response. The officers' families' petition requesting prosecution and describing economic devastation that defensive violence had imposed on widows and children, the revelation that several officers, including 22-year-old recently arrived deputy, had minimal knowledge of constitutional violations and had been killed while following first orders from superior officers who deliberately recruited inexperienced personnel unlikely to question illegal operation. The museum exhibits presenting multiple perspectives without providing definitive answers about whether Karl was hero defending Constitution or killer whose violence exceeded defensive necessity. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how constitutional protections create permanent tensions that historical cases like Karl's illuminate without resolving, that acknowledge both egregious government violations and extraordinary violence that killed people bearing varying degrees of responsibility, that demonstrate how founders' framework deliberately created ambiguities about government authority and individual resistance that Americans will perpetually debate without reaching consensus because competing values about security and liberty cannot be simultaneously maximized. Comment about whether Karl's precedent should influence modern law about resisting illegal or mistaken law enforcement operations, whether distinguishing between deliberate violations and honest mistakes is coherent standard, or whether defensive rights should protect citizens regardless of government's internal intentions that cannot be assessed during violent confrontations, whether killing 23 officers over 3 days exceeded proportional response, or whether systematic elimination was necessary to prevent additional raids and prosecution for initial defensive violence. Because these questions persist wherever constitutional protections confront government power, wherever Americans debate whether founders created framework empowering resistance to tyranny, or whether contemporary society requires accepting that some government mistakes will occur without citizens being permitted to respond through defensive violence that risks officer deaths, wherever legal systems must decide whether principles recognizing justified resistance like Karl's case established should influence modern standards, or whether changing circumstances require abandoning precedents from frontier era, when territorial governments sometimes recognized constitutional limits that contemporary doctrines have eroded through protecting law enforcement from accountability. That Karl's case once demonstrated could include defensive violence that government would decline to prosecute when violations were sufficiently egregious. Until next time, remember that Karl Isaacs killed 23 officers defending Homestead from warrantless raid, that territorial government declined prosecution, determining defensive killings were justified homicide, that Supreme Court majority in 2020 distinguished Karl's precedent-limiting application to egregious violations rather than honest mistakes. That discovered memorandum revealed even Attorney General declining prosecution had questioned proportionality, that officers' families petitioned for accountability that legal system denied, that museum presents multiple perspectives without definitive answers, and that ultimately Karl's legacy is permanent reminder that constitutional protections mean nothing without practical ability to resist government overreach, but that defining limits of legitimate resistance will always divide Americans because founders deliberately created a system where tensions between authority and liberty would require ongoing negotiation rather than permanent resolution.